Hey there guys, and welcome to session 38 of LiteLike. In this session we went ahead and implemented random encounters, the port encounter, and port exploration in general. So those are the things we're going to go through. It actually is probably going to be a little bit shorter of a video, but we hit all our goals for this session, so there was no reason to make it any longer. The next thing that we would be working on would be dungeons and planets, or I should say planets and stations rather, planets and stations, which would be dungeons and cities from a dark room. Those would be the two features we would be adding, but I felt like potentially that would add way too much depending on how well or poorly that was implemented. So for that reason, we're going to hold off. We're going to put those into session 39, but enough with the jibber jabber. Let us go ahead and hop into the changes. And actually, before we get into the changes as normal, we'll go ahead and look at the gameplay, what we have so far, so we can demonstrate. Alright, here we are in game, so I'm going to head over to the docking bay. I have not updated the depart button yet, did not feel really necessary, we can come back for that later. So, I'll hit depart, we are on the map. Map is now up, and if we move around, as you can see, we can go now onto the unexplored port, and as you can see, this is our default Space Brigand encounter. Whenever you enter an unexplored port, that's the same exact thing every single time. And when we go into combat, here's combat. As you may recall from the demo, this is exactly how it looked. Everything transferred over just fine, and so long as I don't die here, we will be able to complete that. And here's the collection screen, again, which you may recall from the demo. Nothing had to change here, so nothing did change. So we'll go ahead and collect our scrap, close that out. And when I step off of this, as you can see, I actually just went directly into a random encounter. Random encounter, first off, I should say, random encounter is actually random. It is a random enemy. However, I only have one enemy programmed in at this point. So, not so random encounter. However, this 100% is random. And this random tiering for both the encounter and the rewards is something that I implemented this session. So we'll go ahead and pick those guys up. And as you can see, where we used to have an exclamation point, we now have this hash sign. Because this is no longer an unexplored port, it is simply a port. So we'll hop up in there, get a little message saying that we can pick up supplies. This will also refuel our ship. So if you can see in the background here, fuel is at 20. If we were on a smaller screen, you may not be able to see that, but for the time being, that is how that is working. We'll collect our repair bots, and when I step off of this, you'll see it's gone. And if I try to go back in, this is just a random encounter by coincidence. Absolutely has nothing to do with it. Just a coincidental random encounter. We'll collect that stuff. But, oh my goodness. I actually... So, one of those things. Randomness is randomness, right? So, I can't help this. This is live. We'll collect this stuff and then we'll go back to the base. It appears that I am just... As you can see in the background, my cargo was at 30. So, that's why I could not pick up the last thing. We'll head back to base now. And as we return to the lighted base, again, this is based off of this right here, this display right here. So that's how that thing is formatted. Unloads, and we talked about that before. So, as mentioned before, all our scrap and whatnot went into the colony. The scrap, the batteries we got, went into the colony, and we are back here. And that is everything we completed for this session. So, let us go ahead and actually look at code stuff. Just like last time, we're going to start out in Github with the easy stuff to explain that doesn't need me in VS Code. And then we'll move on to the harder stuff in VS Code, or at least the stuff that requires more explanation. Alright, just going up the list here. English.json, got some more text, easy enough. It's just stuff to facilitate what we've implemented. Nothing really to say there. In utils, we added in this random int right here function. This is stolen directly from Mozilla's implementation, just copy paste, easy enough. And the reason we implemented this is because now we can have random reward amounts as well. So if it was just random items at set amounts, then that would be random choice, which we already have implemented in utilities. But this will allow us to actually do random amounts of rewards as well, which is useful. Over here in map, we are exporting empty because it's going to be useful for other people. We actually could export all the other symbols, but we haven't done that yet because I don't see a reason for that. However, exporting the empty symbol is useful for doing replacements, so that's why we're doing that. And then evidently I did not convert all the dungeons to planets in these files, so we have some more of that. Additionally, you'll see this right here, this clear list. This clear list was implemented in order for us to clear ports. So now the game can remember what ports we have cleared. And you'll see all the way down here, this .clear list index of structured ID. So that is how we're handling that. So when we're setting up the map, we can check for whatever structure we're about to put down and then replace it with the port map. So that's how that's implemented using the clear list, like I said. Next up, distance from home was updated to allow for a location. Previously, this just used the player location, but now we can actually grab different locations. You know, for example, the target destination that the player is moving to would be one use case for that. But regardless, it was just updated so they can use any location instead. And then right below that, as you can see, get location tier. So this is how we're determining how difficult things are when we randomly generate encounters, events, etc, etc, etc. So this is part of the whole entire tiering system. And then all the way down here, this is the last part of the clear list functionality. So whenever we clear a port, this is the code that actually adds the port to the clear list. One thing that I jumped over here that I probably should point out is we are implementing a structure ID. Again, because this is pseudo-random, it's not completely random. It can be loaded from a seed, and therefore structures are always put down in the same exact order, which means that structures from one play session to another have the same exact ID. Therefore, in our clear list, we're saving the structure ID inside of there instead of the structure location because that's easier. And that also means that, however, we need a lookup system. So we're using the location of the item to get information about the structure. So for example, as you can see, ID and the structure itself. So we'll know at this coordinate that we have a structure, which is, for example, a planet or a station, etc, etc, etc. And that ID for that structure is such and such. About 2 seconds here in items.js, just to explain that the resource did not actually have the type quick hint on it. So we had at one point made it so that you could always call regardless of the item type .type in order to get the correct subclass, the correct type prototype, okay? And we had never actually implemented that onto resources because there was no need. So we implemented that because now there is a need, and I'll get into that in just a second. All right, I was trying to figure out where the best place to start explaining this one is, and there's no real good place. So I'm gonna just start on the simplest place right here to point this out. And this is in the colony GUI. So over here in the colony GUI, you can see we made this change from player.resource_id -1 to player's resource ID.quantity -1. So you may recall in the past that at one point I said I did not see a reason why the player needed resource instances. And when I started working on weights for the character and making sure that the weights were all lining up, because you'll recall we were getting the nan over in the colony GUI, which is part of the reason I'm starting here. I realized that the major reason to have resource instances on the player, as opposed to simply raw numbers, is because it makes our life a heck of a lot easier in a couple different areas to actually have the resource instance rather than having the number, for example, in that weight situation. So in that case, we can just call resource.totalWeight to get the total weight of the resource, rather than having to calculate that ourselves manually. And in order to calculate that ourselves manually, what we would have to do is we'd then have to get the instance ourselves in order to, or the resource type. We'd either have to pull the resource type off the game object or create our own instance in order to get that base weight to calculate it ourselves. So for that reason, I reverted a lot of code in here and changed it back to handling resources as instances as opposed to base quantities on the player. So that includes stuff like up here in the drag resources. This is the drag resource section right here. So this had to be changed to do quantity instead of just a base number. And then hop over to the character, the actual player character itself. And as you can see down here, we have to update all this. This is an add resource. So add resource now from the get resource is going to get a resource instance, which is how it normally would work with passing in true here. But then we got to modify the existing quantity, put that directly in and return it instead of how we were doing this here. So we had to update that. And since we're handling all that stuff and we're handling this as a resource object, now the remove resource actually makes sense. So before we were just removing the resource manually because all it was an object key and value pair, right? So we were just manipulating that straight up. Well, now at this point, we can add in the actual remove resource code, which looks exactly like, or very similar, I should say, like many of the other functions on the player. Again, I've talked before about amalgamating all the equipment functions, for example, add and remove and get equipment, just making that one function for each of those things, and then it having either a way to figure out what you want or for you to provide what you want, and just abstracting away all the other stuff, you know, so you don't have to think about it. And with all that out of the way, I think we will hop over to the next group of changes, which is going to end up being, well, here's a quick one right here for you. Just making sure that the transport is topped off here. It's one of those things, it keeps on coming up. We probably should do something like this because we've had to add this code in a number of different places. But I had to patch this in because the colony, when you bought the item, was not topping it off. So now it tops it off when you buy the transport from the shop. So that was fixed. And then moving rapidly on to the GUI, the colony GUI. A couple different things here. One, we renamed just a bunch of this stuff. So this is just very clerical, easy stuff right here, which is just getting a short name for this .game.player. This was previously, as you can see, this .game.player, and we just shortened it to player. However, this is the more important part here, where we actually set up preloading the player's loadout on the docking bay, in the docking bay on that page. So previously, when you loaded in from a save game, we did not actually have it auto-populating your loadout that you had saved from previous. So we needed to implement that. That's just a very simple get all the weapons and update the player inventory. Again, we have this function sitting around, so we'll use it. Same thing with items, get all those and update that, easy. And then for resources, just obviously create a list, or I should say an object full of resources that need to be updated that are on the mech, and then call update mech. So that's very simple. Again, this is not something complicated enough that I need to open up VS Code for, which is why we're just going over the short form. Over here in the game GUI, we have a couple additions. Now that we have combat, we have a combat game over. I rearranged this. As you can see previously, we had encounters GUI, update GUI sequence. I added that to its own function because I was going to do something else originally. I ended up solving my problem there a different way, so this just kind of looks silly and extra. Like it shouldn't be here, but I didn't bother resetting it to the way it was, because in the future we can extend this function, this establish encounter function, if we need to. So one of those things, no harm, no foul, no reason to change it. Otherwise, you can also see right here, this is where we check for combat. So you can see current encounter equals this.game.encounter. This is inside of the game over, check why you died screen function. So if current encounter is going to be encounter sequence in this case. So we're going to go ahead and get the actual encounter instance by using current encounter.get, and that will recursively, if you forget, go through all nested encounter sequences to get the current actual encounter instance running, as opposed to just the next encounter sequence down the tier. And at that point, we can check to see if it's combat, as you can see right here. So if the encounter type is combat, then we know to pass to this got game over, the combat game over string. And then the last two things we'll talk about in GitHub before we swap over to VS Code. Here in gameplay scripts, I forgot to switch this over to C resource as opposed to P resource or regular resource. As you can see, it went from regular resource. We split regular resource into C and P resources, and that would be resources on the player or the colony. So this was updated. This is the shop callback is what this actually is. This unlocks the shop. I realized that we had never changed this over because I decided to start up a new game to make sure everything was still kosher from the start of the game, and realized after like 5 minutes that my shop still wasn't unlocking, and I went, wait a second, why isn't the shop unlocked? So that was a very silly one character change that needed to happen in order for that to work. And then over here in IO, first off, weapon.type.id, as you can see here, previously we just had ID, which was not good. That did not work, so that was a problem. And the next thing is down here, we make sure that the player always has an armor. So if the player does not have an armor, then the player's armor is going to equal basic armor. And that just fixed a couple of problems down the pipeline that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later. But just suffice it to say is if the player did not have armor before, it broke some stuff. So I just added that in. Then here's our clear list. That works very simply. That's just the clear list, right? There's nothing really to say about that. We're making sure to put that into the save data so you can load it back out on the map. So the map has persistent cleared ports. And then hopping up here because I skipped over it, here's our tier data stuff. This is getting, we needed 2 import tiers. We weren't importing tiers from the JSON previously. Those were implemented, officially implemented. We had a space for them in the JSON right up here in encounters, as you can see right here, tiers. We actually started populating that. So once we had that populated, then the IO actually had to bring those out, suck those out of the JSON, and return them to the game object. And with all that out of the way, we are now ready to hop into VS Code. Alright, so really quick at the top of the screen, as you can see here, we have a couple extra strings here. Bandit and port, those are extra messages we added in. We have this .clearList right here, which is ports that have been visited on this map journey, as opposed to ports that were cleared. Those ports that were cleared were actually on the map object itself. This is the map GUI. So this is the list that we keep each time you go out onto the map, travel around, and then restock at these ports. They get added to this clear list. Next up, down here in events, we have a lot of events to take care of in order to get things functioning. We have to add a bunch of events in order to actually get the GUI to respond. So we got enter unexplored. Again, that is the bandit encounter when you enter an unexplored port. We have enter port, which is the one where you collect the cash that was left behind, the repair bots and the fuel. And then we have leave unexplored, leave planet, and leave station, which will do various things we'll talk about in a minute. Move end here, as you can see, that literally says check random encounter, so you understand what that does. And no encounter means that we were in an encounter sequence at some point, either a random event triggering on the page, in a station, on a planet, in an unexplored station doing combat with a bandit. I said unexplored station, but you understand unexplored port, or a regular port where we're collecting cash. One of those things ended at this point when this callback, or when this event is triggered rather, and therefore we check map block, and that should be unlocking the map so that you can start moving around again. Next up, down here in update map, previously we just had a couple lines here, but now we have things to actually clear. So we have this replacements object that we're putting together, or I should call it an array really, this replacements array, and that will get passed into getMap. And getMap will look at each of these arrays right here, which is a location and a replacement symbol. And that's why we have the export on map.empty that I mentioned before. So for each of these locations in our clear list, it will replace the symbol at that location with the empty symbol. Down here in update HP and supplies, I had to make a quick edge case right here. So when, as you can see, the game is initialized, the new game will not, the player will not have a transport. The way the player gets to the map is by buying a transport. So if he doesn't have a transport prior to that, but we set up the map before the player can actually get to it, then at that point, we're going to attempt to get player.reactor power, and that's not going to work. So this is a quick check to make sure that the player has a transport before updating the power on the map. Otherwise, we get an error, right? If we try to call player transport reactor power, it would say cannot read reactor power of type undefined is what it would say in the error log, something to that effect. So in order to avoid that, we do this check right here, and we've got a default power right here just in case, just as a catch-all. And that is just a little bug fix is what it is. Next up down here in show map, we updated it so that we clear our clear list. So again, every time you go out onto the map, you show the map. The map again only happens when you're leaving the colony. That's the only time it gets called. Therefore, we're safe to clear off all our ports that we visited, all our caches we collected from. We can reset that, and we can also top the transport off to make sure that it's at max, because if the player's leaving the colony, his ship should have been fueled up already. We shouldn't have to worry about that. Down here in check map block, this is exactly what I explained to you before. So if the map box is up and we are no longer in an event, now we could get events in the colony. That's not something we've actually implemented really in the gameplay object. The gameplay object hasn't actually had events, colony events, put into it yet, aside from short messages such as you can now build batteries, the build battery event. So for that reason, since that could be another reason why we get a no encounter signal, which is the thing that brings us over to check map block, we will first check to make sure that the map is on the screen, which is what we're looking for. And if it is, then map block should be false because we have no encounters. Definitionally, we have no encounters because this is getting called. Down here in enter colony, we had to update this because the player now has actual resources. So we updated this to, for example, say resource.quantity, etc, etc, etc. And then all the way at the bottom of enter colony, we added this little reset the player's HP thing right here. So one of those things, when you go back to the colony, you will get all your HP restored. There's not really a reason. Well, at least it's not part of the original gameplay of a dark room that you have to pay for healing in town. If you went back into town, then you're full healed. We're keeping that mechanic. You don't have to go back to the colony. And then the colony's like, man, I realize you've been doing like all this work for us, like going out, collecting exotic resources for us. You were the one who actually established the base and gave us a place to live. I realize you've done all this stuff for us, but yeah, you know what? You're gonna have to pay for your own medicine. That's not how this is working. You are the leader of the colony. You get free Medicare. So that is how we have this set up. And then next up, as you can see here, we have our various functions for entering and leaving points of interest. So leaving structure, as you can see right here, we just clear the structure at location, because one way or another, whether that is a planet, a station, or a port, in any of those situations, and again, I say that because up here at the top, we bound to those specifically with this function. Leave unexplored, leave planet, leave station. Those all go to this leave structure right here. In all those situations, we are clearing that structure. You do not leave a planet, a station, or an unexplored port without clearing it. If you did not clear it, you got a game over. So we never actually get here. We can guaranteed clear it. Next, enter unexplored. As you can see, well, first off, we have this build unexplored port sequence, which is a function I added to encounters.js. So down here in encounters.js, we'll just look at that really quick. It is just a shorthand to build the basic bandit encounter. Now, the one special thing I had to do here is put in a way to customize the bandit message. So what that means is now when we call build combat encounter, as you can see, when it checks the message string, it checks the message string to see if it's a function. Type of message string is function, and if it is, it replaces it with the call to the function. The function will get these enemy and the rewards in case you need to customize those things, and should pass back an appropriate message to put into the message encounter. And again, the reason that is important is because we are using localized strings, and therefore we need a way to customize that. So heading back over to where we were, We pass in the message callback.bind right here. We need .bind because obviously it's going to get lost. And that localizes the bandit string and then localizes the actual bandit message, which we have up here, which I showed you at the very beginning, right? This bandit right here. So that is in English.json. For example, it has a substitution, which is opponent, and then we can pass in the bandit name as it is localized. And obviously once that happens, we add that to the game encounters and we're good to go. Next up, enter port. As you can see, with all these, I didn't mention this before, but with all these, we lock the map before we do anything else because the player should not be moving off of the port after you moved onto it once the encounter is triggered. So first off, we check to make sure that this location is actually available. If this is on our clear list, then that means that we don't actually want to do anything. And the reason we have to do this is because even though the map physically, looking at it on the screen, is not showing the port there, the map on the back end doesn't have any mechanism to clear it itself. We are clearing that on the front end and saying that the player cannot revisit there. The map on the back end is actually still going to trigger the enter port, even though that is an empty symbol right now after we visited it once. So that's why we have to add this code in. Next up, obviously, we now want to make sure that it's on the list. It wasn't on the list before. It certainly is on there now. And then we have the build port sequence, which again is another little helper function that I added in here. It does a callback, which tops off the player's transport. And then it has a reward encounter, which gives us items. And the reward encounter comes with a message. So here we have message right here. Simple enough. And just add that onto the game encounters. And then the last thing to talk about before we start talking about combat itself, because that's a whole nother category, is the random encounters. Obviously, the port sequence, the unexplored port sequence, is a combat, and this is going to be a combat here as well. But before we actually start talking about the ramifications of that, let's just talk about what is going on first. Now, I skipped over this dot encounter rate in a couple different places here. You might have noticed on the screen. For example, all the way up here at the top, there's this dot encounter rate right here. And we also have these constants now. So as you can see from this label right here, the max chance of having a random encounter is 75%. So you're never guaranteed a random encounter. You have a chance to move 20 squares without a random encounter. That is just a vanishingly low chance of happening. A very slim margin of you ever moving that far without one, but there is still a chance. It adds that little bit of uncertainty to it. You know, you're not certain that you will. You might be able to make it back to kit base without actually dying. You know, it adds a little bit of tension there. Next up, we have the rate that it actually increases, because we don't want to leave it at a flat rate because that gets a little bit boring, right? So it's going to start out 0. You're going to have 0% chance on your first move that you are going to run into an encounter. And then for each square after that, it's going to go up by 15% or 0.15, as you can see here. Again, maxing out at 75. Likewise, I skipped over this dot encounter rate equals 0 here on show map. So when you first leave the colony, your encounter rate goes back to 0. You have a 0% chance when you first leave the colony of running into a random encounter. And now with all of the backstory out of the way, here we are in check random. So if the map is locked, don't do anything. Do not trigger a random event if we are already in an event, okay? If something else popped up that causes us issues, then don't bother. So for example, if you went into the unexplored port, don't trigger a random encounter on top of an unexplored port, for example, or a station or a planet, obviously. Next up, we go ahead and check whether or not we actually have a random encounter. If we do not have a random encounter, that means that we've rolled. For example, we rolled our D100 right here, and D100 was over 0.75%, which means that we do not have a random encounter. So in that case, we just increment the encounter rate by our amount. And we're just taking math.min here just to make sure no shenanigans are going on. Next up, now that we actually are in a random encounter, we can lock the map. Now we can say, okay, you are in a random encounter. Make sure you don't move. Then we get the tier, so map.getLocation tier. We talked about this over on the GitHub page. Just gets the tier for the encounter based on the distance from the colony. We build the combat encounter. Now you'll notice we're passing in null here and tier here. So this is how you generate a random encounter. We had that kind of set up before, but we had to add some code in there. Actually, let me finish this up before that happens. Before we talk about the code we added in random encounters, let's talk about the rest right here because it's only 2 lines. Add the encounter, the random encounter to the game. Easy enough. And then encounter rate goes back to 0. So after you run into a random encounter, your encounter rate goes down to 0. As you saw when I was doing the demo, I had 3 combats in a row. I took a step and then got another random encounter. It happens, okay? So sometimes your luck is just bad. Now, over to the changes in encounters. So here in Build Combat Encounter, again, previously we did not have stuff for randomizing the encounter. We did not have that infrastructure available, but now we do. So this right here is just a very simple random choice out of our tier combatants. This is just the enemies. We're just taking a random choice out of whatever our tier is. Now for nomenclature's sake, we are calling it tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Technically speaking, everything should be 0 indexed, but I'm not going to worry about it, okay? We're going to just subtract the 1 here. Maybe this is bad on my part. It's just when we're talking about tiers of encounters, a tier 0 does not very much make sense for most people. So I decided to keep it at tier 1, 2, 3, etc. instead of 0, 1, 2, 3. And that means that in order to access our array is 0 indexed. We do therefore have to subtract 1 from that. This was just the same as before. Created combatants did not change. And if we did not have the combatant, then this should technically be an error, but as usual, we return. Next up, rewards. So we generate a random number of rewards here, as you can see, between 1 and 3 rewards. And then we start randomly picking them. So you can see rewards.push, random choice, and those are our tiered rewards. Now, down here in parse rewards. This is the next thing we had to change because as I said, I added in the possibility of us generating a range of objects. Now, back in the day, as you might recall, I said there's no need to generate a range of objects because you can just roll more. So if you want to be able to generate between 1 and 5 scrap, then you can just roll 5 scraps on the random roll for random resources. I decided I didn't particularly like that because if you're going to get 1 of a scrap, then it's more likely to get more of a scrap, right? So instead of having, let's say the rewards for this encounter is going to be 10 items, okay? And then you may end up with 5 scrap, you may end up with 1 scrap, you may end up with 0 scrap, etc, 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 but you may also wind up with 20 scrap. So that gets a little bit silly there, you see? But we need that big number because we want to be able to generate a range of each individual item. So for that reason, we implemented the random range on the JSON. So if I hop over to the JSON right here, as you can see, we can enter in an array with minimum maximum number here as a quantity. As you can see right here, this item 0 is repair bots, as you might know, and that is always 1. So you could technically get 3 repair bots as a reward, but that means that you roll a repair bot 3 times on the random reward numbers. So that's the deal there. That was the change there in order to make that happen. All right, and now we are ready for combat. All the stuff that happened with combat. Now, when I first implemented combat, I sat there and I went, you know what? I think this is going to work out great. I think there's going to be literally no time I spend debugging this. I think it's going to be implemented exactly perfectly because there's not much of a difference between the way we implemented it in the demo and how we're implementing it here. So I was really hyped about that. And then various things broke. So we are over here in the character file right now instead of the combat file because, as you may recall, we changed how weapons actually work on the character. So now that weapons are actually in the equipment thing and the weapon slots can be empty, now we actually need to check for that. So that was the first thing. So I was getting to update weapons, which updates the timers on each of the weapons for their cooldown and warm up, etc. And I was getting an error because we were checking a slot and the slot was empty, and therefore weapon.cooldown was undefined because weapon was undefined because the slot was empty. So we tossed this right in here. Now, unfortunately, that was not good enough for several different instances, and therefore we had to actually change how we're handling this a bit. So right here, as you can see, we now have this dot_weapons. And the reason we have this is because I did not want to rewrite a whole bunch of code. So instead, I put in a getter for weapons and items that only returns full slots. So if the slot is empty, it does not return the slot, which means that I do not have to constantly check for empty items in these things. Now that does also mean that I can delete this line right here, but for the sake of being on the safe side, I decided to leave this line in. I decided it's not hurting anything, but technically speaking, because I swapped this over to getters to just get lists that are full, that are guaranteed full, this line is deprecated. It's no longer necessary. But again, just to be safe. So that was the first thing I had to fix, was fix this whole entire mess where I kept on trying to get weapons. For example, in get random weapons, I had also had this line right here up there in get random weapons, and then I did delete that one. But again, running into the same problem because it was trying to random choice out of a list with no items in it. So that was a bit of a problem. Next up, I was running into a situation where the weapons were not coming off a cooldown, which was a problem. So I would fire the weapons once and they would not go off a cooldown. They would not come back up for me to fire them again, which meant that the bandit was just constantly killing me. And the reason for that was all the way up here at the top, right here. Somehow, I don't know how, because this shouldn't have worked in the demo if it was working before, but this, as you can see, is weapon change, and this is what we were listening for the state change on the weapons for the warm-up and cooldowns. This said weapons change before, and weapons change was not working. Weapons change is different from weapon change. That S makes a huge difference, and therefore it was never actually triggering the callback. So since it was never triggering the callback, it was always trying to trigger weapon change, and we were listening for weapons change over on the GUI. That wasn't actually working, so I had to make that change. That took me a little bit to figure out. Next up, here in combat.js, here you can see I've got armor equals 0. And this is because, as I mentioned before, if the player does not initialize with armor, there will be problems. Well, even though we are making new players with armor, we are generating new characters when you hit the new game, your new player character has basic armor. So that's safe, but in case we create a monster that does not have an armor, this would still fail right here because it would try to access armor equals action.opponent.armor.value. So value would be on undefined, and undefined does not have a value property. So in order to avoid that, we just set armor to a default of 0 and then check for armor. And if it does have armor, then we can steal the value off of it. So that was another thing that had to be fixed. And then up here in the combat loop, this section right here was working funny. I don't entirely know why, but it was actually not triggering correctly. So previously this said this.victor equals enemy and not this.lockout. Now if the victor equals enemy, then this.lockout should be true. That should happen. There's no reason why the victor should be enemy and it's not locked out. However, as it turns out, it was. So we had to fix this. We had to check first, and then if not lockout, call the player KO, otherwise return. So we had to make that change. I can't remember what exactly that was screwing us up with, but that was, I recall, causing a problem which had to be fixed. All right, and then with the GUI, I ran into a kind of funny issue where it was skipping the game over text. So I was dying to the bandit, and I wasn't getting my cute little flavor text talking about how I died. And that was weird, and that took me it definitely had to be more than half an hour. It very well may have been close to an hour to figure out what the heck was going on, because I had to go down the entire encounter rabbit trail. I had to keep on checking different points in the encounter sequence to figure out what was going on, because it seemed like I was just playing not populated in the message, And then it seemed like I was somehow skipping over the message. I was somehow doing game.cycle encounter multiple times, and I couldn't figure out how. And as it turns out, this is the reason why. So over here in the game GUI, we explicitly set the encounter. We don't add it to the encounter list. We want to stop everything that's happening with this encounter and display our own encounter. Just stop what you're doing, only show our encounter. Now that involves cleanup on the other encounters. So if we hop over to combat, at this point, the default on exit for combat, which is also the default over in the encounter generation, is to cycle the encounter. Problem is that if the combat cycles the encounter on top of the encounter getting cycled because we're setting the encounter on the game object, that means that it's cycling it twice, and that's what I had to figure out. So what we do here is we check this .game.encounter.get, and if its instance is not this .combat, because the instance on the encounter is the combat instance itself, and we have a reference to this .combat for handling all sorts of stuff. You know, our listeners, our callbacks, etc., etc., etc. Our inputs, our player inputs. So if we are no longer the encounter, then don't do anything. Do not call any on exit at this point. Otherwise, as you can see right here, we can continue doing what we were doing before, which was setting our default cycle encounter on exit and then checking our encounter options for an alternative. But this was the important thing right here. The important thing was, before we do anything else, make sure that we are still the active encounter, because if we are no longer the active encounter, we don't want to screw with the encounter sequencing that something else has set up. We don't want to mess with other people's encounter sequences, and we just want to die silently. So that was, again, at least half an hour, possibly close to an hour of going through all the pipe work for encounter sequences and just constantly putting in little debugs here and there, little console logs, and figuring out where exactly we were going off the rails with this. And that's everything for this session. So again, pretty good session. I'm actually really content with the length of this. I think, you know, again, with the exception of that whole entire encounter debacle sequencing with the game over, which again cost us probably half an hour to an hour, I think this timeline right here isn't terrible. If there was an hour less, then that'd be good, but probably a decent amount of content for right now. And moving on to session 39, we can look forward to implementing the stations and the planets. That is the next goal on the list. And from there, well, frankly, I think we're just on to content. Technically speaking, it would be content, you know, generating some content for the game to fill out our random encounters, especially since we're going into stations and planet, which are fully randomized. So going into those two situations, we are going to want to have content in order to pad those out. However, beyond that, the only other thing that I can think of is an end game. You know, making sure that we actually implement an end game into this game. And that is a topic that, frankly, I have not really thought much about. I had ideas, but at the same time, I never actually settled on one of them. So we'll talk about that a bit more at the end of next session and see where we're going. Again, session 39, so we'd be on session 40 if we do session 40 as content session, you know, just generating a whole bunch of content for the game, for the core gameplay. That would be reasonable as a session. Otherwise, we could, if I get a good idea that I'm really excited for, we could move towards building the end game in session 40, and that would be ideal because I wanted to have this done in 40 sessions. And you can kind of discount the content generation as a session. You can say that is something that does not necessarily need to happen as part of the gameplay development, because again, this is randomly generated content, this is randomly generated encounters, and therefore not part of the core game itself. So for that reason, it would be nice to be able to say, okay, we have built the entire game sans filler content in 40 sessions. That was the goal in the first place. I would have liked to gotten the whole entire thing, including the filler content, done in 40 sessions. But even then, filler content would be session 41, so we're not off by much. So that is the state of it. You know, I think we are quote unquote kind of on target. Now, originally the actual on target was 40 hours of development, and we are well past that. We are, if not at 80 hours of development, then past 80 hours of development. I don't think we're under 80 hours of development. So we are more than double development time that I was expecting. Part of that is definitely because we drastically extended the scope of this game. As I've talked about before in the past couple of sessions, this originally is based off of a minimalist game, and I said, you know what? Designing a minimalist game is only going to take just so much time. And the big change was this is not so much a minimalist game anymore. This is actually a full roguelite at this point. So for that reason, our expectations do have to change a little bit. Regardless, that's all conversations we can have once the game is done. So I think it's time to say, if you guys have been watching, thank you. And I hope you have a really wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at in the world. And I will catch you next time.